nerds. I'm starting a new series on From Plato to Foucault by Peter Sloterdijk. I think that's how you pronounce his name. And he's a German philosopher who died in the 70s, or wait, no, died within a decade, I think, in the last decade. But anyway, he was heavily influenced by thinkers like Heidegger, Foucault, and Plato. And we'll get into his very interesting intellectual views here in terms of Nietzsche and Heraclitus. And it's interesting too, just for context for this paragraph, that Nietzsche was heavily influenced by pre-Socratics like Heraclitus. The pre-Socratics were, of course, were the philosophers who predated the Socratics, like Plato and Socrates, of course. So, and Nietzsche got was some of Nietzsche's main ideas basically were inspired by Heraclitus, like his ideas of eternal recurrence, the will to power, and the Übermensch. So all some of his most famous ideas, of course, right? And those were all apparently inspired by Heraclitus. And of course, I've mentioned Heidegger many times before, and I'm doing a series on Heidegger and Aquinas by John Caputo, he's a post-structuralist philosopher, and Heidegger, of course, was 20th century. I'd say he was a phenomenologist who also studied metaphysics a lot. So anyway, he has some interesting different influences here, and he'll outline some more here as well. Okay, so let's get into the paragraph. Born just after World War II in Karlsruhe, Germany, Sloterdijk is widely considered to be his name is spelled the way his name is spelled in our uh, Western pronunciation. It sounds like it's spelled Sloterdijk, like Sloterdijk, but his last name is spelled Sloterdijk. So I think it's Sloterdijk in that sort of pronunciation, but I could easily be wrong. But anyway, Sloterdijk is widely considered to be the most foremost public intellectual in Europe. As an undergraduate, he studied philosophy, literature, and history at the University of Munich and received his doctorate in German literature from the University of Hamburg in 1975. After completing his doctorate, he had a doctorate in German literature. Then he went to India. After completing his doctorate in German literature, he went to India to study under an internationally renowned mystical and spiritual guru, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, or Osho, famous Indian mystic, of course. So we went from getting a doctorate in German literature to studying with an Indian mystic. Much of Sloterdijk's work remains indebted to Osho's teachings. So, Sloterdijk was influenced by every philosopher, not every philosopher, but philosophers from Heraclitus to Nietzsche to Osho. Very interesting and different influences, right? So, much of Sloterdijk's work remains indebted to Osho's teachings, which are themselves largely indebted to many religious and theoretical influences, including Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity, and psychoanalysis. One of Osho's central pedagogical techniques was the employment of paradox and contradiction as a means by which to help individuals transcend and transform their mental and spiritual capacities. So basically, paradoxes are good, and we should deliberately use paradoxes in order to transform our mental and spiritual capacities. Because if we use these paradoxes, then they can allow us to shift our worldviews in order to highlight our worldviews and perhaps the errors in it, so we can improve our philosophy and our ideology based on these paradoxes. So, like I say in the thumbnail here, sophistry is good now. Entering into paradox was a way to move beyond the safe distance to intellectual critique and into the full. So if you employ paradoxes, you move beyond intellectual critique and into the fullness of living itself, reminiscent of two figures that bookend the Western philosophical tradition, Heraclitus and Nietzsche. So So Sloterdijk says that based on the teachings of Osho, we should employ paradoxes deliberately in order to allow us to move beyond intellectual critique and into the fullest of living itself. More spiritual approach to philosophy, even though he has the hardcore philosophy of Nietzsche and the ancient philosophy of pre-Socratics like Heraclitus. So we should employ paradoxes in order to move beyond our intellectual critique and into the fullness of living itself. So Heraclitus and Nietzsche. Sloterdijk's journey to India gave him the creative power to live with the ambiguity of existence's synthetic differential unfolding. So synthetic or artificial. I don't know whether he means that in the Kantian sense, like as in a synthetic a priori claim or an assumption that I would say that you don't have to justify and is just taken on faith, essentially. Um, but anyway, you can just say for the purpose of this artificial differential unfolding. So basically, in a nutshell, this is all Peter Sloterdijk using the teachings of the advocating for the teachings of the Indian mystic Osho to use paradoxes in order to allow us to move beyond intellectual critique and into the spiritual fullness of life. So, we should use paradoxes deliberately in order to allow us to go beyond intellectual critique and into the spiritual fullness of life.